Well, thank you to everybody who's joined us today for this session of the North Central Farm and Ranch Stress Assistance Center webinar series, presented to you by the National Agrability Project. My name is Paul Jones. I manage the National Agrability Project, which is headquartered at Purdue University in West Lafayette, Indiana. Our topic today is tensions of farm succession, and our presenter is Joy Kirkpatrick from the University of Wisconsin. And by the way, happy 2/22/22 to everyone today, if you did not realize the uniqueness of our date. A little background on the USDA NIFA Farm and Ranch Stress Assistance Network, commonly known as FARSAN. It was first established through the 2008 Farm Bill and is administered through the National Institute of Food and Agriculture, or NIFA. The main purpose of this network is to provide stress assistance programs to people who are engaged in some area of agriculture. There are 4 regional FARSAN centers, and if you would like some basic information on how to contact those centers, you can go to agrability.org/resources/FARSAN. For those that are not familiar with Agrability, we are also funded by USDA NIFA, National Institute of Food and Agriculture, and our focus is on working with people in agriculture that have some type of disability or functional limitation. That could be a physical disability, or it could be a behavioral or mental health issue. Every one of the Agrability projects around the country is a partnership between a land-grant university and at least one nonprofit disability services organization. Currently, there are 21 state projects around the country and 1 national Agrability project. Again, that's here at Purdue through the Breaking New Ground Resource Center. Our partners on the National Agrability Grant include Goodwill of the Finger Lakes, the Osteoarthritis Action Alliance, AgriSafe Network, Colorado State University, and Washington State University. If you'd like more information about Agrability, you can go to agrability.org, where you can also view over 130 archived webinars covering a wide range of topics. And again, we appreciate and acknowledge our support through USDA NIFA with our grant numbers supplied at the bottom of this page, both for the National Agrability Project and the FARSAN Network. Again, our presenter today is Joy Kirkpatrick from the University of Wisconsin. I will not read her entire biography, but suffice it to say she has extensive experience in extension, and particularly in this area of farm succession. She's authored a number of publications. She's certified to instruct in mental health first aid, and I think she's going to also provide a little background about herself. So at this point, I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and I'm going to turn things over to Joy for the body of the presentation.
Thank you, Paul, and thank you for the invitation to speak to this audience. Farm succession is near and dear to my heart, so I get pretty excited when I get to talk to a group of people who kind of want to know about farm succession. I'm just trying to set up some things here so that I can see all the screens that I need to see. As Paul said, I'm going to do a little more introduction just to let you guys know that I work at the University of Wisconsin on the Madison campus, and I am a part of the Division of Extension, and also I work out of the Center for Dairy Profitability, which is also a center that not only has people on the Madison campus, but on some of the other campuses here in Wisconsin. And while it's the Center for Dairy Profitability, we work with, especially with our farm management and farm succession, we work with all types of farms. Just for the fact that we're in Wisconsin, though, a lot of the farms that I work with are dairy farms. So I'll just let you know that as well. So just a little bit about me. So this is my, I will be starting I think this is my 29th year. 11 of those I was a county educator, the dairy and livestock agent in Richland County. So I have that county experience. And then the remainder of those years I've been working at the state level, working on farm succession mostly, and with some research on farm succession. And right now I'm also working with the farm stress. We have a subaward with the North Central Region's First SAN grant. So we're working with that as well. As my bio had that Paul showed, I have my bachelor's and master's from Southern Illinois University at Carbondale. I grew up in a farming family in Southern Illinois, and I'm the youngest of seven. And I always joke that my dad and my mom and dad, if anything, they were at least good human resource managers, because there's 19 years difference between myself and my oldest sibling. So they had a lot of labor throughout their farming years. Maybe not so great on the succession planning part of it. They weren't great managers for that, but that's another story. So what we're going to talk about today is a little bit of research on stressors and particular to farm succession, and then dive into a little bit deeper on those farm succession tensions, a couple of pieces of research that have looked at that. And then I'm going to hit on some strategies to address some of the tensions. Maybe I won't get to all of them. I want to make sure that I have time for questions, the Q&A as well. So we might go through the research a little bit faster than the other two things, just so that we can have more time for questions. So I'm going to start out with just highlighting, and I do have resources, the research at the end of this PowerPoint. I think this will be shared as a PDF later with everybody, but I just want to hit on a few of the research articles, journal articles that I've seen, policy briefs that have talked a little bit about farm succession as stressors. In this first one, that is ordinary versus extraordinary stressors, they describe, I want to first describe what they say are documented as extraordinary stressors. So that's weather events, drought, flood, derechos, tornadoes, hurricanes, decreases in commodity prices, market prices for farm products, any sort of federal policies or tariffs that close or diminish markets for American farmers, and rising interest rates. So these are things that are what they're saying beyond the control of the farming family. So just keep in mind that those are the extraordinary stressors. And then Dr. Braun, who wrote this policy brief from the University of Maryland, discusses that the ordinary stressors are the constant responsibilities required of any family, but with some specific characteristics for farm families, with the farm both being the family home and their place of business. So when you think about for farm families, a lot of times the profit margins are such that there needs to be off-farm employment, maybe to bring in health insurance or some family living. And so you've got that stressor. So you're working basically, looking at working more jobs. And then thinking about the pressure of the different generations working on the family business, that's front and center in those family-owned farms. The conflicts are around management, decision-making, and transfer of the assets. So within this discussion, remember, we just said that the extraordinary stressors define the things that are beyond the farm members' control. But with this definition, we wouldn't be placing farm succession as extraordinary. But when you think about the multiple family members who are who is controlling the decisions, there may be plenty of decisions that might not be in somebody's control on that farm. So it could feel extraordinary to them. So I just want to point out that that farm succession can be extremely stressful, even though it might not be one of those completely defined extraordinary ones. In that second piece of research, the researchers interviewed key informants, and they indicated that finances, planning, and family concerns are 3 of the top 5 drivers for farm stress. So key informants were people who worked with farmers, maybe extension educators, and consultants who were working with farmers. So when you think about finances, planning, and family concerns, within planning, farm succession was specifically identified. And there are few farms where finances, succession, and family concerns are not intricately intertwined. So in this study, the researchers noted that family concerns included generational differences in priorities, worries about letting the family down, and fears about that family legacy. And then burnout and hopelessness. The reason that I added this one to just talk about briefly is that this is a study that was done in the eastern part of France. So I think we can look at that, and so a lot of the farm succession research has found that a lot of these issues are universal, right? It's not just unique to Wisconsin, United States, but a lot of these things are universal, a lot of with the stressors. So what they found with this grant or this project, research project, was the researchers found that family succession of the farm to be one of 8 factors identified as farmers' job stressors. Of the 8, farm succession landed in the number 7 position. Just for your information, the workload and lack of time was number 1. But when we look at the descriptions for the farm succession factor that they heard the most were they were afraid that their children would face the same difficulties in farming as they did. There would be a fear of not being able to transfer the farm to their children. And then the third one was fear of having to find a successor outside the family. So when we think about that, I just wanted to point that out because of that universal quality. And then the last one was in early 2021, as part of the subaward that Wisconsin received for the First Sand grant for the North Central region, a group of researchers here in Wisconsin conducted focus groups around farm stress. And farm succession, again, rose to the top with it. It was within the top 5 stressors. And I just want to show you this was a qualitative research because it was a focus group. And so there's this one quote that I think is one of many that illustrates the pressures that legacy can create when you're talking about legacy. That pressure, that next generation may feel that pressure to keep it up, keep it going, or maybe they feel like, it's in their blood, it's in their family, and they just have to do it. So then, as I noted in the description of this webinar, farm succession is so much more than the technical details of legally transferring assets and dealing with taxes. If it was that simple, we probably wouldn't be really talking about it today, right? We wouldn't be talking about the tensions of it. Farm succession, even when family is taken out of the equation, is messy because it involves people have emotions, and different values and different goals. So the first work that I was aware of, and in my opinion, captures the concepts of this sort of human, messy emotions, is the work from Pennsylvania that was the dialectical tensions underpinning family farm succession planning. So this research was done in 2009, and they interviewed the farm family members who were in various stages of succession planning. And they concluded there were 5 tensions present in these farmers' conversations. So then, fast forward to almost 10 years later in 2017, I and a group of extension colleagues conducted a series of 4 focus groups specifically around farm succession. We had the county educators invite those participants, and we were looking at balancing those who had completed a plan, were maybe in the middle of a plan, or didn't have a plan, and then also a balance between men and women, and then owner and successor generations. So these 2 research studies identified very similar barriers or tensions around farm succession. I actually prefer the word tensions over barriers. I feel like barriers may imply that they are insurmountable, and in some cases, maybe they are, but where tensions could be used, the word tensions could be used because I think it's a more nuanced word, and we can say that tensions are just that, maybe not good or not bad, but they just are. And I think we have to maybe normalize these tensions, and not think that if your farm or your family's experiencing one or more of them, that something's wrong. Or you're not doing something right. I think we just need to acknowledge that they're that these tensions are there and address them. So I'm going to compare the two studies with these five tensions. So those tensions are financial, communication, what I call fair versus equal, change and control. So when we look at the financial one for the Pennsylvania study, they reference that as that profit versus affordability, right? The competing needs of the financial between the competing financial needs between generations. I think that when you think about that, maybe in Pennsylvania where the development pressure may be higher than in other parts of the country, I think that would be really important. Although I see that issue in Wisconsin as well, and we'll talk a little more about how we look at that in Wisconsin. But that idea of looking at what land values are now and what profit margins are, that's always a concern. We'll talk a little more about that. For the Wisconsin focus group on financials, it manifested in words like profitability, needs from the farm, like what family living needs must the farm provide. They talked about debt. The question came up, is the farm big enough, right? And they were thinking about those land values increasing, and can that next generation afford it? As I said, we'll talk a little bit more about that in some future slides. That second tension is communication. For the Pennsylvania study, what the participants were saying were that this was seeing the need for having very clear and explicit conversations around succession planning, but either preferring or relying on assumptions more, right? Making assumptions and not having that conversation. In Wisconsin, the word that kept coming up was transparency. And they coupled that with, especially around income and finances, roles and duties and decision making. So thinking about trying to make those conversations, make farm meetings, like business meetings, more consistent and more transparent was what the Wisconsin group mentioned a lot of times. They also talked a lot about how do you start the conversation? How do you even start the conversation? And family dynamics was included in this as well. Like, how do you communicate the plan to the non-farming children and employees, and the concern of maintaining those family relationships once the succession is complete. The third one is that fair versus equal. In Pennsylvania, the discussion was treating children equally, or do you treat them fairly? And there's a difference there. Those words, we'll talk a little bit about that again in some of the strategies. We'll talk about that. And in Wisconsin, this was discussed from the perspective of if you have a person, a successor already on the farm, and you're not looking at how the assets will be distributed at death, or how inheritance assets will be distributed. The idea that a decision or a lack of a decision in that area of inheritance distribution can be putting the business at risk, right? If there's not some thought put to that and some conversations held, what's that successor? How does that successor know how to plan for making sure that those business assets are intact? They also talked about needing more separation from the business from the family. The fourth one is change. For the Pennsylvania group, the phrasing that they used was progress versus continuity, right? Wanting things to be done the same, but the next generation is also wanting to put their management mark on the business. So what would that look like? And that tension that's there between those two things. And Wisconsin, I have to say that basically the vibe of that research was that they just didn't really like change of any sort. But I want to go back to that progress versus continuity conversation from Pennsylvania. When I do presentations in person, when I talk to farmers individually, when I work with them individually, I try to really have that kind of pull apart that progress versus continuity. Because in some farm families, I've seen this happen where the successors coming back to the farm or coming to the farm, maybe they've had some experiences someplace else or have gone to school, maybe technical college or a 4-year degree, and they're super excited to bring back a lot of new ideas to the farm and see how their management decisions affect the farm. And sometimes that owner generation might take that idea of change or these new management ideas as you've been doing it wrong, right? If there's something that needs to be that successor generation wants to change, they're taking it maybe a little too personally and saying, sort of inferring that successor saying you're doing it wrong. But I want to say that that's usually not the case. When we think about it, the decisions that owner generation over the decades, maybe some decisions that were made 30 or 40 years ago, those decisions were made with different set of facts, right? A different economic situation, a different sort of situation with thinking about control of, sustainability of agriculture decisions. So different set of facts, different set of decisions. That successor, first of all, should recognize that the owner made some right decisions because they're still farming and have a possibility perhaps of transferring the farm to that next generation. But that owner also needs to look at that successor coming into it may have a completely different set of facts that they're working with on what the parameters are for them to farm. So they might be making some decisions that look very different than that owner generation's decisions. And I really challenge that to have people think through that, because when you go back to the phrasing, progress versus continuity, we want that, like they think of it a lot of times very narrowly of I've always done it this way, right? And the management has always been done this way. I would challenge them to think about continuity in a broader perspective of the farms continuing, the farm staying in the family. And you might need to have some progress for that kind of continuity to happen. That last one is control. In Pennsylvania, it's looked at retaining versus letting go of control. And in Wisconsin, the words we're using were passing on management. Some of them talked about fear of losing the homestead if they gave up control decision-making. Some phrasing about thinking about gradually letting go. And then the other piece that came up in Wisconsin is that the owner generation, and I would say that a lot of times, I mean, and this is in our society, your identity is so wrapped up in what you do. And when you think about an owner generation suddenly not having those management decisions to make or those tasks on the farm, their question might be, what are they if they're not a farmer? So that retaining or control may look like on the outside it's because they don't trust that next generation, but it could be much more internal about loss of identity as well. So when we think about, I want to move on and talk a little bit more about a couple of these tensions. First, I want to talk about the financials, and a reminder, in Pennsylvania, they called that one profit versus affordability. So this particular slide is from the USDA National Ag Statistics Service, and it's showing that progression of real estate values in the United States. So when you look at that, land values have been going up consistently across the country. I know that these these actual numbers of cost per acre may seem small for some of you, depending on what part of the country you're in, but this is a national average. And so you're seeing that continued growth. And then another study, another paper noted that between 1990 and 2015, farm real estate values increased 6% every year except one during that time frame. So when you think about this increase in net worth and this realization of increase in value in the land, how do farmers, that owner generation, when they're thinking about maybe slowing down or, heaven forbid we use the word retirement, retire, how do they realize that value that they've been holding on to this asset and it's been increasing in value? So how do they do that, right? They either have to sell that at full market value, or they have to borrow against it to improve the business in hopes of increasing their revenue. So that's how they leverage. They either sell it or they leverage it. But if there's a next generation that's coming into the business, can they afford to pay that full going market rate for land in the area? Or can the farm carry the debt that maybe that farmers use to leverage to improve the business? And then also the debt that comes into it when the successor is trying to buy those assets from the owner generation, debt upon debt. So when we look at the farm assets, the way I discuss them when I'm working with farm families, I like to put them into what we call the 3 buckets. So you got these farm assets. What do farm families want these assets to be? So there's usually 3 things. We've got those retirement assets. So that owner generation is looking at, what a lot of times they've put all of the profits that they've maybe made over the years back into the farm. So they may not have a lot of liquid or specific retirement asset set aside for the retirement. So they're looking at these business assets probably being a big chunk of their retirement assets. And also I want to point out that farmers, if they're anything, they're usually excellent tax managers. So they may not report a lot of income from year to year. And so they may not be getting a lot back in Social Security when they look at that. And for these reasons, the farm has to be their retirement plan. So they need to either sell the assets or stay in the business in some way to provide some income for their later years. Then there's also the idea that they need to stay intact for that business, that successor, right? If a successor has been identified, they may already have been heavily committed to the business, and those same assets are needed so the successor can continue that business. And then for many families, there might be that expectation that they're also inheritance assets, right? So if you have more than one child, you've got an on-farm child and then some non-farming children, what does that look like? So when I work with farm families, we talk through this, we try to help them think through, can it be all 3 things? And sometimes if we've talked before, if there's still debt on the farm, you might need a 4th bucket for that debt. So when we think about that, these are some issues that we really have to work through as we're working with farm families. So then let's talk a little bit about some strategies to address these tensions. I probably won't dive super deep into all the strategies have strategies for each one, but some of the ones that I see that come up a bit more. So the strategies for addressing the financial tensions, one thing that I find interesting is that, and this is probably not different for farm families versus other families in the United States, but knowing for sure what you're spending on your family living needs and thinking about it. For farm families, it can be a little bit nuanced, right? Because if the insurance that you're paying for the farm, it also includes some insurance for the house. If you're looking at utilities, those sorts of things that you have to sort of kind of pull apart. But knowing what your family needs are, that owner generation, that successor generation, and how might those be changing if there's some transitioning going on. And then the next one would be having some true financial analysis of the farm financials, right? Having a look at the trend analysis. Is the net worth been going up? Is the income statement showing some profitability? trying to make sure that it's, thinking about and coupling those two things is to answer that question of, is the farm big enough? I think that's a really important piece to think about as well. And we think about the goals of the owner generation. We really want, I think we need to know the goals of everybody who's involved in the farm. But I have to say that, you know, the one, the person who holds the purse strings gets to make a lot of the decisions. So if that owner generation still has control of a lot of the assets, then we really need to know what is that owner generation's hope for the future, hope for their own personal plans of slowing down, their future, the legacy of the farm, those sorts of things. I think that's really important for the owner generation to know what they want going forward. I don't want to minimize the goals for everybody else, but if they're still holding the purse strings, I think that's important. And then really starting to have transparent conversations around the farm financials, bringing that successor generation in to be looking at them on a consistent basis, having them be a part of the conversations with the lender, I think can be really important and help them. Not only does that just help everybody understand what it can do, but it's also can be a great mentoring component so that successor generations being able to learn that as they're going along, rather than just being handed everything and not having the opportunity to build those skills. So then the next one would be the discussion that we had about strategies for that fair versus equal tension. The wordle that we've got there, that word cloud, I guess, I wouldn't call it wordle, that's the game. The word cloud is some of the biggest things that, the number of times that this phrase or those words were said in the Wisconsin study. That's how those come up. So that business risk, sibling harmony, there's an emotional piece to, succession or inheritance, right? Does that mean that, if someone gets more than another child, is that how they view the measurement of their love? I think there's lots of things that can be unpacked from those sorts of conversations. But the thing that I want to point out is that owner generation makes decisions concerning farm succession. They may be, especially about that fair versus equal inheritance, they are subconsciously considering three principles, whether they know that these principles are what they're considering, that this is what they're talking about. There's these distributive justice principles. The equality principle is where assets are divided equally among the heirs regardless of their contributions. There's the proportional equity principle, which in contrast of the equality one is that the distribution of assets is in proportion to the heir's contribution in maintaining or growing the asset. The stickler in that one, when you start thinking about, well, if that's what an owner generation wants to use, is the proportional equity principle. When does the heir's contribution start? How do you value them, right? That has more details and more questions to ask. The needs-based principle is that the heir's needs are given primary consideration. So there's actually been some research done in Oklahoma by Shannon Farrell and one of his graduate students that shows that the equality principle does not usually help reach the goal of transferring the assets and control to a second generation if they want that farm to stay a farm or that farm or ranch to stay that way. So the equality principle is not usually helpful. So let's think about maybe looking a little more deeply into that proportional equity, right? That where the contributions that's what they're looking at as the contributions of the heirs. Contributions can be defined as money, labor, management, providing care and maintenance on the home and facilities of that owner generation, right? If that successor, that heir is the closest one that lives to the parents, and they're helping them live, maintain, and be able to live in the home longer, that can be of value, right? Because as soon as they move to skilled care, the money is going to start being used up, or assets of some sort of way. It could be mechanical repairs on the farm, allowing those aging parents to stay in their home. So these are questions to consider that when you think about the proportional equity distribution. Like I said before, when do the contributions start? Does it begin when the heir becomes an adult and makes a conscious decision to continue providing labor? Or is the childhood labor considered? Have those on-farm heirs been compensated at a fair market price for their labor? Or are they receiving below market wages in the promise of making things right, in quotes, with inheritance? Is this arrangement been documented? That would be important as well. And are they adding value to the farm with their labor and management? Is that business growing and the owner generation's assets growing because they know that they have consistent labor and additional management? And would this growth have happened without the on-farm heirs? These are some questions that you really have to consider. And then, so I'm going to kind of move a little more quickly because I want to get to questions. And then that needs-based principle of asset distribution. On the surface, it may sound like that might be a little unfair, but when you think about needs-based principle, we are looking at the providing heirs with a percentage of the assets based on their needs for them. It's not on the heirs' contributions, but when you think about some examples of that, it might be that family members with disabilities or medical needs, maybe there are minor children that need to be cared for, could be some examples of that. So if thinking about that needs-based principle might be an appropriate situation for some families. So what I have here with this QR code and this website link is that our University of Wisconsin Division of Extension has a farm management website, and we have specifically some articles about farm succession and transferring the farm. And this QR code and website takes you to some strategies that you can use after you think about what principle you're going to be using. That you can look at some strategies that may be able to help you move forward with your decisions. So then the next thing that I want to talk a little bit about is that starting the conversation, right? The when, where, and the how, the communication piece. So you don't probably want to do it at Thanksgiving. That might not be the best place to do that. There's kind of already stress a lot of times around those holidays. So adding this kind of conversation. Now, if you've got people traveling home, there's not everybody's home at the same time. Maybe the Friday or Saturday after Thanksgiving might be an appropriate time. But you also want to think about the where. And I really encourage farms to think about maybe not having it on the farm. A couple of reasons would be that there's so much activity. A lot of times people can get distracted. They get pulled out to some sort of operational business. One time I had somebody where the hoof trimmer pulled in and the dad was gone for an hour. So thinking about maybe moving it off of the farm might be helpful. And then the other piece would be a lot of times when we think about having meetings on the farm, it's usually at the owner generation or the parents' home, and it's usually at the kitchen table. And there are positions of power, right? If dad is sitting where he always sits and the children are sitting where they were sitting as they were growing up, there may be some power places that you want to avoid. So taking it off farm at an extension office or someplace else that's still private would be important as well. I'll quickly share some of the meeting agreements that I use for farm families. I won't go through every one of them, but I think that really thinking about having some meeting agreements as you have these business meetings was really important. You might even want to think about having some other ones that I think about is starting and ending on time, having an agenda so ahead of time so people know what's going to be talked about. And then also the piece that I always encourage farms to do is maybe start with an agenda item of the things that went right in the last week since the last meeting, because if you only talk about situations that need to be addressed, right, challenges or things that are really take a lot of effort to really negotiate and talk about, you'll stop having them. But if you can start the meetings with something positive, maybe end positively as well, that would be really important. And then the one thing on this slide that I want to point out is confidentiality. When we meet with farm families, we make sure that they understand that what's said is confidential. We don't share it with anybody. But I think within families, you need to talk about who's knowing what, right? Where's the circle of the conversation moving out to, so that everybody's aware of who it's going to be shared with or who it's not going to be shared with. And just a quick plug for if I think it's a lot of times when people have these conversations, it's easier to have someone who's not related to them helping them start these conversations, right? That's what I tell farm families is sometimes the best thing that I can bring to the table is that I'm not related to anybody. I can ask maybe uncomfortable or difficult questions. And if you guys want to be mad at somebody, you could be mad at me because then I can go home. So when you think about if you're needing to start these kinds of planning, we do have people who have gone through some training and are certified through the International Farm Transition Network. And this website has lists of coordinators in all the different states. We even have a couple that are trained in Ireland. And then I do want to share that we have a couple of webinars that the University of Wisconsin Division of Extension is offering free webinars. March 4th is, we're going to talk a little bit more about a workbook that we've developed that helps farm families with conversation. The workbook is not something that if you work through all the worksheets that you're going to have a plan. This is really a workbook just to help you with components of your plan and to start the conversation. So if you want to learn more about that, you can join us on March 4th at 11 o'clock. And this QR code, as well as the website, is where you would go to register. And then on March 18th, we'll talk specifically about transferring farm management. And we're calling that one Who's the Boss? And again, you can register for those free webinars. At the point, hopefully by March 4th, we will have that workbook available online to download. Right now, we just have hard copies, but we're hoping to have that available at either the day of that webinar or shortly after that. So if you're interested in that webinar or in that workbook, I would encourage you to join that March 4th webinar to learn more about that. And then there are my references, and this is my contact information. I think this will be sent out later to everybody who registered. And that's where we are. I'm going to stop sharing and see if we have some questions.
Thanks so much, Joy, for that excellent information. We appreciate all your expertise, and we do welcome questions. I believe I'm going to be turning things over to Ed Sheldon here in just a moment for questions that have come in so far, but feel free to continue to enter questions in the chat area. Again, if you would like to ask a question verbally, we would ask that you go to the reactions icon at the bottom and then click on the raise hand icon. One other reminder, I would again ask you if you could please give us some feedback in terms of evaluation, and I am again entering that link in the chat window area. to take you to our brief survey. Okay, at this point, I'm going to turn things over to Ed, and I'll continue to monitor chat also for questions.
Okay. Yeah, we have a few questions. So I think a couple of them kind of double up on each other, so we'll try to combine those. But first out of the box, how early should the conversations about succession start? I mean, how long before an anticipated transition do we start talking about these things?
Every family, every farm is different. It's, I feel like I'm a lawyer. It depends, would be the answer, but I'm not a lawyer. So I'll try to answer the question as much as I can. I think what I encourage, like if you've got someone who's, in high school who seems really interested, the things that I'll say is that I would encourage people to have their children have some off-farm experience, right? If that's going to school, working for someone else, I would really encourage that. And I know that there's a risk there, right? If they go off into the world, they might not come back. But you want to make sure that they have some experiences so that they're making an informed decision, right? Have some experiences having someone else be their boss other than their parents would be really important, I think. And then I have actually seen farms have that as like, basically they have a list of like policies of you need to go off the farm before you can go back so many years, and you need to be coming back and proving how you're going to contribute to the farm, right? Things about that, making sure that they are showing how they're going to improve something or be a part of, make things less expensive if they are the ones doing it. So things like that would be, I think, really important conversations to have. The earlier the better, right? To have and the owners need to be clear about what their expectations are. So that in itself is a conversation of making sure that the owners are on the same page and are consistent through that conversation with their children. And then how long before the transition is anticipated? So I would say that, for example, like if you've had, like if I come into it and I'm working with a farm family and they're the successor's already in the business, maybe as an employee, I really encourage, you've got that like testing period, right? You want to make sure that you can work together as adults. And so you don't want to maybe get tangled up in ownership super quick, because it might not work out. And then it takes a little while for those things to you want to, if the successor leaves the farm, but you also don't want to leave them an employee forever either. You need to get them built into some management and some ownership gradually. So kind of depends on, again, the farm, but just really being intentional about what the expectations are could start super early. And then making sure that you don't leave them in that, like sometimes there's that phase where you've got them committed, but you don't have them getting into either ownership or management in a really meaningful way is a concern, right? That's kind of where things stall sometimes. So, so once you get the conversation started, you need to have some milestones, and while plans or notoriously, you have to be flexible with them. Having at least an idea of if everything went perfectly, this would be a time frame is really important for that successor generation.
Okay, very good. Okay, and this kind of followed you heard you mention a lawyer, and we actually had another question come in very similar to this a couple minutes ago, but after I shared the screen, but talk about the importance of professional help, like attorneys, accountants, and when do you bring them into the process? And then we talked about when to start the conversation with the family. When do we start bringing in the professionals?
So for the most part, at least with my experience with attorneys here in Wisconsin, a lot of them are would prefer that you have some of these conversations, like what you want to do, how you want things to look, even though you might not know the technical things, right? They actually prefer you to work with someone else, like an extension or technical college instructor or someone for Wisconsin. It's our Department of Ag's Farm Center, have people that work with farms on this. Because if you go in without having an idea of what you want with an attorney, they're going to give you like a laundry list of ways to do it, right? They're good, and then you're not gonna know for sure what you want to do, or they're going to give you one way, right? It's going to be one or the other, and you need to know, like, if you come in with an idea of what you want and what your goals are, they can actually do a better job for you and tailor that. So, I think you'd want to start bringing them in when you're really had some ideas. Bring the attorney and the accountant. One of the best meetings I had was where the lender, the accountant, and the attorney were all in the room at the same time. They had decided some ideas of what they wanted to have happen, and it just got hashed out right there at the table. So if you can get them all to meet, if the schedules align and you can afford to pay for those professionals that charge for that particular kind of process, that would be the best way to do it. So don't wait till the very end, but maybe don't start them right at the beginning, kind of sweet spot in the middle.
Very good. Take advantage of extension programs while you can. Absolutely.
Exactly.
Okay. I think I'm looking at one that just came in to compare. So how do you get the communication started, especially if the older generation doesn't really want to address the issue? And let's see, how do you get parents to communicate to off-farm siblings when they refuse to communicate the plans of farm succession? So these pretty well tie together.
Yeah.
How do you get it started?
How do you get the communication started? I don't particularly like this way, but if you heard of something that went terribly wrong because somebody didn't plan and didn't talk about it, right? You can talk about, like, oh, so and so down the road has just got an awful mess because there weren't any plans or whatever. I don't know. Sometimes you can maybe start by having the question of, what do you not want to have happen, right? Maybe they've had some experiences that they've seen that they know, and maybe even though that's sort of a negative question, might get them in a way to start talking. One time I had, we used to do these programs called Returning to the Farm on the 4-year campuses, and I know for sure that Iowa and Nebraska still do those. And a father so it was required that the students came, but other family members need to come. And one of the fathers came up to me and he said, I didn't know my son even wanted to come back until he brought this brochure home. So if there's any way that you can start bringing in news articles or brochures about workshops or things, trying to get people sort of understanding that you're willing to talk about it, maybe that could be helpful. That's a hard one though, because if they own everything and they don't want to talk about it, it's kind of the way that's going to happen. So.
Okay. I think we have one or two more. Let's see here. At least two. What if you don't have a family member who will take over the farm, but you want the farm to continue?
Yeah, so finding a young farmer that can take over depending on what that owner generation needs out of it, right? Like if the owner needs some income from it or needs the sale, finding the right young farmer or beginning farmer who can also afford it is a stickler. If the owner generation isn't as dependent on the assets, you might be able to find a conservation program that where you can place it in someone else's care, and the stipulation is that it remains a farm. There's cost to that. If sometimes you're lucky that you've got a program where they'll pay you for those development rights. But a lot of times it's also where you're paying them to manage that in perpetuity and keep that as a farm. And then the other way, I don't want to get too much into the legal issues because I am not an attorney, but if it's put into a trust and its stipulations of what it can and can't be done with it, that might be a way to go to, but we might have some attorneys on here who could answer that question better than I can.
I think we've got time for about one more that came in on chat after I put the slides up. Okay, any tips for approaching the conversations about mental health during the succession planning and during the execution of the process?
Yeah, that
so
is
programs about stress. So how do we?
Yeah, so I will say, and this is completely unfair of me, but in Wisconsin, we have, with the Department of Ag Farm Center, there's a program that has what they call counseling vouchers. So if I'm working with a farm family that I can tell that it's the family communication or someone's in a high level of stress or have some mental health challenges, I can recommend that they reach out to the farm center and they can have access to counseling vouchers, and they have telehealth, a telecounselor that can also work with them as well. So we have that opportunity here in Wisconsin to work with them and try to offer that. It is a really fine line, right? You can maybe recognize it, but if you're not a therapist or someone who's able to help them, you have to be really careful about staying in your lane and helping them with the things they've asked you to help with, gently giving them opportunities or resources for those other things. And then also knowing if you're the person that's working with them, knowing when you have to say, well, I've done all I can, until you can address these issues, it's going to be really hard for that transition to move forward, or for you to, or at least for you to help them. That's a real struggle because you want to help them as much as you can.
With that, I think I'll pass it back over to Paul and Kate, and Paul, if you happen to see a couple other, any others come in, you might throw them out. But that's
I did
all I've got
notice
on my list. Oh, go ahead.
I did notice one thing here from about the linking program that Iowa used to have. I don't know if Iowa still has that, right? I think there may be some organizations that do that in some states. It is tough because you always have a lot more beginning farmers who are in that, who put their name in the hopper, and very, very few farmers, owner generation farmers that put their names in, because to be quite honest, there's a risk factor that they see, right? They even see a risk factor when it's their own kids. So thinking about bringing someone in that they don't know, it's that idea of how do you vet them, I think is the barrier that I think we as Extension and other people need to think about, how to help people vet those, make sure that those matches are good. Are their values the same? Are their goals the same? Financially, can it work? There's a lot of support around that.
Well, again, thanks so much, Joy, for your presentation, for answering questions here at the end. I would add that there are farm succession teams in various states through the Cooperative Extension Services. You might want to check with those teams, check with your land-grant university to see if they have a farm succession team or a farm stress team that you might be able to check with. I know we weren't able to answer all the individual questions that were posed today, but again, Extension is a great resource and is available in every state. Again, we ask that you would check the survey link that I've put in the chat area several times. Give us some quick feedback, please. We do present these webinars through the North Central Farm and Ranch Stress Assistance Center quarterly. So if you registered for this webinar, you should receive the invitation for the next one. We have not determined the topic, but we should be doing that soon, and you should get an announcement. So with that, our time is up, and we do thank you again for everyone's participation today, and we wish you a good day.